Imagine living your whole life trusting the one person you thought you knew best, only to discover they were hiding something so dark, so shocking, that it changed everything you believed about them. What happens when betrayal goes deeper than you can imagine? Stick around, because you won't believe what happens next. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below with your thoughts. This is a story you won't want to miss. Marianne had been married to John for over 40 years. Their love story wasn't perfect, but it was real, filled with the kind of steady trust that comes with decades of shared memories. From raising children to facing life's ups and downs, they had been through it all. She had always believed in their bond, in the quiet, everyday moments that tied them together. Her life had revolved around him and their home, and she'd never questioned their foundation. But that morning, everything changed. It started with a small, strange moment, an envelope that wasn't there before. Marianne had been going through some old bills in the kitchen when she noticed it. It was tucked under a pile of papers on John's desk, almost as if it was hidden. At first, she thought nothing of it, maybe just another document he didn't want to deal with. But something about it caught her eye. The way it was placed, the neatness of it. It didn't feel like just any old paperwork. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was important, like it was calling out to her. With her heart racing, she walked over and picked it up. The envelope wasn't sealed, and inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a letter, but not the kind she expected. It wasn't from a friend or family member. No, this letter had details that no one should have kept hidden. As she read, a chill ran down her spine. There was a name mentioned, a place she didn't recognize, and worst of all, a mention of money. A lot of money. The words on the paper felt like a blow to the gut. There was no explanation, no reasoning, just a cold, impersonal note that left her questioning everything she thought she knew about her husband. Her mind raced. John wasn't just hiding a secret, was he? Could it be? The letter seemed to suggest something bigger, something darker than a simple financial issue. Could he be involved in something dangerous? Could he have been hiding this from her all this time? She was stunned, staring at the letter, unable to move. For hours, she didn't know what to do. She thought about asking him, confronting him right there and then, but her heart wouldn't let her. The idea that the man she trusted most could be living a double life was too much to bear. But the more she thought about it, the more she felt like she had to know. She wasn't going to sit back and pretend everything was fine. She needed answers, and she was going to find them. It wasn't until the next day, as she rifled through some of John's old papers, that she found more. Another clue that would change everything. This time, it wasn't a letter. It was an old phone bill with strange numbers on it. Numbers she didn't recognize. Numbers that led to more questions. Who were these people? Why was her husband speaking to them? What were they talking about? As the pieces started to come together, her hands shook. She was digging deeper, but the deeper she went, the more dangerous it felt. She couldn't stop herself now. Marianne had to know the truth. But what she didn't realize was that the truth she was searching for wasn't just a betrayal. It was far worse than she could have ever imagined. As Marianne sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, she stared at the phone bill in her hands. Her mind raced. The numbers on that paper weren't just random. They were connected to someone or something that John had kept hidden from her for years. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Each call, each message seemed like a piece of a puzzle she'd never even known existed. She felt a growing sense of dread, but she couldn't turn back now. Her heart told her there was more to the story. She had to keep digging. For the next few days, Marianne became a woman on a mission. She was no longer just John's wife. She was a detective in her own home, searching for answers. She started going through his things with the kind of careful precision that comes when you're trying to unearth the truth. She found old receipts, letters, and more phone records, each one hinting at a secret life she hadn't known existed. She discovered that John had been making regular payments to accounts she'd never heard of. The amounts were substantial, more than their monthly bills combined. Who was he paying? And why? Her gut told her it was something serious, something shady, but she still couldn't put all the pieces together. The phone calls were another puzzle. There were long, late-night conversations that lasted for hours. She thought back to the times when John had been absent, away on business trips or locked in his study for hours at a time. How many times had she turned a blind eye? How many times had she made excuses for him, believing in the man she married? As the days passed, Marianne's suspicions grew stronger. She started asking John questions, but he would brush her off, saying it was just business, that she shouldn't worry about it. But Marianne wasn't buying it. Something didn't add up. She had known John long enough to recognize when he was lying, and now everything about him felt off. The way he looked at her, the way he acted, it was like she was a stranger in her own home. One night, while John was out running errands, Marianne decided to follow him. She had to know where he was going, who he was meeting. She didn't expect to find anything. It was just a hunch, a small, irrational part of her that hoped she was wrong. But as she watched him leave the house and drive in the opposite direction of his usual route, she felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Where was he really going? The drive led her to a small, run-down warehouse on the outskirts of town. Marianne's heart pounded as she parked her car a distance away and watched John walk into the building. It wasn't a place he'd ever mentioned before. What was he doing there? Her breath quickened, and she felt her hands shake as she clutched the steering wheel. She wanted to follow him inside, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not yet. She needed more answers first. The next day she returned to the warehouse, this time when it was empty. She parked her car a little closer, and with a sense of dread hanging over her, she approached the building. She had no idea what she was hoping to find, but the answers were hidden somewhere. She pried open the door and stepped inside. The air was musty, thick with dust and neglect. And then, there it was, something that made her freeze in place. On a small desk in the corner was a stack of papers. As Marianne picked them up, she felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. These were documents she had never seen before, agreements, names, addresses, even bank details. And then she saw it. The name on the document matched one of the numbers she had found in John's phone bill. Her mind raced. This wasn't just about money. This was something bigger. The document spoke of large sums of money being transferred to various places, none of which made any sense to Marianne. They weren't for business deals, at least not any she recognized. There was a deal in there that mentioned something about a meeting, but it was vague. And then, just when she thought she couldn't get any more confused, she came across something even more chilling. A list of names, some crossed out, others underlined in red. What was going on? Why was her husband involved in something like this? The unease in her gut intensified as the pieces started falling into place. John wasn't just hiding money or an affair. He was hiding something far darker. A criminal connection? A secret meeting with dangerous people? Marianne's hands trembled as she realized that John wasn't just living a double life. He was involved in something far worse. She wasn't sure what to do next. The weight of what she had discovered pressed down on her. She couldn't keep this to herself. Not now. But confronting John, with what little she knew, would only leave more questions. She needed more proof. But Marianne didn't know it yet. The worst was yet to come. Marianne spent the following days torn between the truth she was uncovering and the life she had always known. The discovery of the warehouse, the mysterious papers, and John's strange behavior all pointed to one undeniable fact. He was hiding something something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. But what could she do now? She couldn't just walk away from a marriage of over 40 years. She couldn't just confront him without knowing more. Was it possible to rebuild the trust after everything she had found? Or was this just the beginning of a nightmare she wasn't ready to face? Every night Marianne lay awake, her thoughts racing. The man she had loved for decades, was he the same man she thought he was? Could the man she had raised children with, shared holidays and anniversaries with, be someone so entirely different? She started to doubt everything. Every conversation, every moment they shared now felt like a lie, and the fear of what she might find next gnawed at her. Her friends called. They wanted to check in, see how she was doing, but Marianne kept her distance. She didn't want to talk about it, not yet. She didn't want to hear comforting words or reassurances. She couldn't bring herself to explain to anyone what she had discovered, not yet. They wouldn't understand. Who could understand the betrayal of a lifetime? Even if she did confide in them, what could they do? Her problems, her heartbreak, were her own to solve, and she didn't even know where to begin. The tension at home grew with each passing day. John seemed oblivious to the change in her. He carried on with his routine, still the same man in front of her, always the busy husband, the tired father. But Marianne couldn't look at him the same way anymore. How could she? He had betrayed her trust, and the woman who once believed in him without question was now questioning everything. She found herself pacing the house late one night, debating what to do. Should she confront him now? Should she accuse him of the things she'd uncovered? What if she was wrong? What if all of it could be explained away as a misunderstanding? But the evidence, the facts, those things couldn't be ignored. Marianne knew deep down that there was no going back from this. No matter how she approached the situation, no matter how many times she tried to ignore the truth, it was there, haunting her. And if she didn't confront John now, how much worse would it get? But the thought of confronting him terrified her. What if he became violent, defensive, or worse, told her something she wasn't ready to hear? Was she prepared to face whatever truth he might reveal? As the night stretched on, she felt a cold sweat on her brow. She couldn't keep living in this limbo. She needed to act. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it would be. She decided then and there that she was going to follow him once more. But this time, it wouldn't be a casual drive. This time, she would follow him to the heart of the mystery. Whatever he was hiding, she would find it. It was the only way to get closure, to find peace. She had to know. Marianne had always trusted her instincts, but nothing could have prepared her for what she discovered next. It wasn't just John's secret life that shocked her, it was the brutal truth behind it. After days of following him, gathering information, and growing more desperate to know the full story, Marianne found herself back at the warehouse, heart pounding, hands shaking. She had to know what was going on, who John had been meeting, and why he was involved in things he had never mentioned. This time, she was ready. She parked her car a little farther away, hoping to stay unnoticed. The warehouse loomed in front of her, dark and silent. It had always felt like an eerie place, but now it felt like the center of a storm, and Marianne was about to walk straight into the heart of it. She crept inside again, more determined than ever. The papers she had seen before were still scattered across the desk, but something was different. There was a sense of urgency in the air, like someone had just been here, maybe even just moments ago. Marianne's heart beat louder in her chest as she began rifling through the documents again, searching for anything new. Her eyes skimmed over the papers until one document stopped her in her tracks. There, in black and white, was something that made her blood run cold. A name, a date, a location, and a chillingly direct statement. Meeting for the exchange. But it wasn't the deal that caught her attention, it was the name of the person involved. It was a name she recognized from a news article, a name associated with a brutal murder. Marianne froze. This wasn't just about money or shady deals. This was something far more serious. Her hands trembled as she looked at the details. It wasn't just a name. It was the person John had been meeting in secret, a person linked to a violent crime that had made headlines just a few weeks earlier. A murder. Her mind raced. John wasn't just hiding an affair or money. He was connected to a crime, to a murder. But why? Why would John, the man she knew so well, be involved in something like this? What was his role in all of this? Marianne was dizzy with shock, her vision blurred as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. How had she been living with this man for so long and never known a thing about his criminal ties? What kind of man was she married to? Just then she heard a noise from the back of the warehouse, a faint shuffle, a voice. Her heart jumped into her throat. Was John here? Had he returned to the scene? Marianne quickly ducked behind a stack of crates, trying to make herself invisible, but her mind was running wild. She couldn't stay hidden forever. She had to confront him, no matter what it meant. She slowly stood up, her breath shallow and quick, and prepared to face the man who had just become a stranger to her. What she didn't know was that her confrontation with him would change everything. The truth she was about to face would not only shatter the image of her marriage, but it would throw her into a dangerous game of life and death. Marianne didn't know what she was expecting when she followed John into that warehouse, but she was certain of one thing: everything in her life had just changed. The woman who had once been a quiet, trusting wife was now standing at the edge of something dangerous. With the evidence in her hands, the name, the connections to a murder, she couldn't back away. But even as her hands shook with fear and adrenaline, something inside her told her she was running out of time. She had to confront him, had to make him face the truth. It wasn't just about the secrets anymore. It was about survival. Her survival, and possibly that of everyone she loved. As she stood there, in the dim light of the warehouse, her heart pounded. Marianne could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew she had no choice. She stepped forward, her mind racing. This was it. There was no turning back. She found him in the back of the building, talking to someone, a man she didn't recognize. They were speaking in hushed tones, but the instant Marianne stepped into view, the conversation stopped. John's face hardened, his eyes flashing with something she couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or was it just the coldness of someone caught in a lie so deep that even they couldn't find a way out? Marianne took a deep breath, her voice steady but full of the pain she had been holding back for so long. "John," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I know what you've been doing." The words felt like they were choking her, but she couldn't stop now. She wasn't just confronting a betrayal. She was confronting the man who had been living in her home, sharing her life, while hiding something far worse than she ever could have imagined. John looked at her, his expression hardening. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice flat. But Marianne could see the hesitation in his eyes, the guilt, the fear. "No, John," she replied, stepping closer, holding the papers up for him to see. "I know everything. The warehouse, the money, the lies, the murder." For a moment there was silence between them. The weight of Marianne's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She watched as John's face drained of color, his jaw tightening as if he were trying to control the storm that was about to erupt. But Marianne wasn't afraid anymore. The truth was out, and there was no more pretending. "You've been living a lie," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "How long, John? How long were you going to keep this from me? I trusted you." John took a step back, his expression changing from anger to something deeper, something Marianne couldn't fully understand. Regret, fear. Whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore. She wasn't interested in his excuses. She wasn't interested in the justifications he might offer. The man standing before her was not the husband she had known. This wasn't the man who had loved her all those years. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking now, though he tried to keep it steady. "I did it for us. I had no choice. You don't know what it's like." But Marianne wasn't listening. She had heard enough. "No, John," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I know exactly what it's like. It's like living a lie. It's like waking up and realizing that the person you thought you knew is someone else entirely. It's like waking up and finding out that the man you love is capable of murder." John recoiled at her words, but Marianne didn't back down. She had to face him now, for her own peace, for the truth. "I want answers," she demanded. "What's going on, John? Why? Why did you do this?" The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could suffocate her. Marianne stared at John, waiting for him to crack, to admit the truth that had been hiding behind his eyes for so long. She wanted to scream at him, to shake him until he told her everything. But instead, she stood there, her hands clenched, her chest tight with the anticipation of the answers she was about to receive. John's face twisted, his eyes flickering to the documents in Marianne's hands. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind, struggling to come to terms with what he had been caught in. For a moment, it seemed like he might confess, that the truth would finally spill out. But then something shifted. "I never wanted this to happen," John muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "But you wouldn't understand, Marianne. You couldn't." Marianne felt a cold chill run through her. There was something about the way he spoke, so calm, so detached, that made her blood run cold. What had she really uncovered? What dark path had John been walking down all these years? Suddenly, John stepped forward, as if making a decision. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in their conversation, he seemed to look at her, not as his wife, not as a woman he'd been married to for decades, but as an outsider, a person who could never understand. "There's no going back from this," he said, his voice low. "You were never meant to know, but now that you do, there's no point in hiding it anymore. You deserve to know everything." Marianne felt her heart race as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. She wasn't ready for what he was about to say, but she needed to hear it, even if it meant shattering the last remnants of her trust. "I was involved in something much bigger than you could ever imagine," he confessed, his voice trembling. "That murder you're talking about, it wasn't just an accident. It was planned, and I was part of it. I didn't have a choice, Marianne. They made me do it. They told me that if I didn't do what they asked, they'd kill you and our children." The words hit her like a physical blow. The murder wasn't some random act of violence. It was connected to her family. Her mind swirled as the full extent of John's betrayal settled in. He hadn't just been hiding money or leading a double life. He had been involved in a murder to protect them, to protect his own secrets. "John, why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you trust me?" He closed his eyes for a moment, almost as if he couldn't face her anymore. Then he took a long, deep breath. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid that if you knew, you'd leave. I was trying to protect you, in my own way." Marianne stood in shock, trying to process the weight of his words. He had killed someone to protect them. He had put them all in danger. But it wasn't just for money. It was to cover up something darker, something that no one should ever have to know. In that moment, Marianne realized that her marriage had been a lie from the beginning. The man she had loved and trusted wasn't just flawed. He was someone she didn't even recognize anymore. And now, there was no going back. Marianne's world felt like it was falling apart around her. The revelation about John's involvement in a brutal murder had shattered everything she had once believed about their life together. She had spent years building a life of trust and stability, and now it all seemed like a lie. John wasn't just a man hiding an affair or a financial secret. He was a man who had put their lives in jeopardy, all to protect a twisted web of deceit. As the truth sunk in, Marianne's mind raced. How could she have been so blind? She looked at John, who stood there, his face an unreadable mask. The man who had promised to love and protect her had kept this dark secret for years. And now he was confessing it as if it was nothing more than a mistake he could fix. But Marianne knew that there was no fixing this. The damage was done. The person she had once known no longer existed. John was a stranger to her now, someone she couldn't recognize, someone who had betrayed her in ways she hadn't even fully understood yet. "I never wanted to hurt you," John said quietly, his voice trembling, but his words meant nothing to Marianne now. "I just wanted to protect you." Protect her? From what? From the truth. From the life he had been leading all these years. She couldn't comprehend it. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. She had trusted him with everything, her heart, her family, her future. And now she was standing in front of a man who had murdered someone to cover up his lies. "Protect me," she repeated, the words bitter on her tongue. "You've destroyed everything, John. You've destroyed us." The silence between them stretched on, thick with the weight of their words. Marianne could feel the tension in her chest, the overwhelming sense of loss. Her mind kept going back to the same question. How could she have been so naive? How could she have missed the signs? How could she have been married to a man who was capable of something so cold, so violent? Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to process everything. The reality of the situation was setting in, and the fear, the anger, and the disbelief were all bubbling to the surface. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to move forward. But one thing was clear. She couldn't stay with him. Not anymore. Not after what she had learned. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can't be with you anymore. I can't live in a house built on lies and murder." As the words left her mouth, Marianne realized that this wasn't just the end of their marriage. It was the end of everything she thought she knew about herself. She had been living a life of illusion, and now she had to face the painful truth. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who was capable of murder. The next few days were a blur. Marianne couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Everything in her life had been turned upside down, and she was left to pick up the pieces. The house felt empty, like a shell of what it used to be. She had tried to hold on to the life she had known, the memories of happy moments, but they all felt like lies now. How could she ever go back to that? How could she ever look at John the same way? She couldn't even bring herself to tell anyone what had happened. The truth was too dark, too twisted. How could she explain to her children, to her friends, that their father had been involved in a murder? How could she explain that the man she had trusted had hidden this for so long? The thought of facing anyone, of speaking the words aloud, felt like a weight she couldn't bear. John had tried to contact her, tried to apologize, but Marianne wouldn't answer. She didn't want to hear it. His apologies meant nothing to her now. They were just empty words designed to ease his guilt. But nothing could make her forget what she had learned. Nothing could make her forgive him for what he had done. As the days passed, Marianne's anger grew. She was furious, not just at John, but at herself. How could she have been so blind? How could she have trusted him with everything, only to find out that he had been living a lie? She felt betrayed on every level, emotionally, mentally, and physically. Her heart ached with the loss, but her mind was consumed with questions. What else had he been hiding? What had he really been involved in? She knew she would never get the full truth, but part of her wanted to know everything. Part of her wanted to hear the full confession, to understand why he had done it. But she knew that would never come. It wasn't just the murder, it was everything. John had lied to her for years, and the depth of his deception was something she could never forgive. She spent hours alone, crying, thinking, trying to make sense of it all. She thought about her children and what they would think if they knew the truth. She thought about the future, about the life she would have to build without him. But for the first time in a long time, Marianne knew that she had to take control of her own life. She couldn't keep living in this shadow of betrayal. She had to move forward, even if she didn't know how. The decision to leave John wasn't an easy one, but Marianne knew it was the only choice she had. She couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies, and she couldn't live in a house where the air was thick with secrets and regret. She had to leave, not just for her own peace of mind, but for the sake of her own sanity. One evening, as John sat in the living room, waiting for her to speak, Marianne gathered her things. She had made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait any longer. She couldn't. She couldn't look at him anymore without seeing the man who had killed to protect his lies. The man who had betrayed her in ways she couldn't even fully understand. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, her voice steady. John didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at her as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. For a moment, Marianne thought he might try to stop her, but he didn't. Maybe he knew that nothing could change her mind now. Maybe he knew that his actions had driven her to this point. He had no one to blame but himself. "I hope one day you can understand why I had to leave," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "But I can't stay with you anymore." With those words, Marianne walked out of the house, leaving behind everything she had once known. She didn't know where she would go next, but she knew that she had to find a way to move on. She had to start over. As she drove away, Marianne looked back one last time at the house they had built together. The house that had once been filled with laughter, love, and warmth. Now it was just a reminder of everything that had been lost. But Marianne wasn't going to dwell on that anymore. She wasn't going to let John's betrayal define her. She was going to move on. It had been weeks since Marianne left John. The first few days felt like an endless fog, like she was living in a dream. Or maybe it was a nightmare. She didn't know. She only knew that every time she closed her eyes, she saw the face of the man she had once loved, and it was always the same, cold, distant, a stranger. She had left the house, left the life she had built, but the memories, the doubts, and the questions stayed with her. How could she have been so blind? Why hadn't she seen the signs? But as the days went on, Marianne began to heal. Slowly. She didn't need to forget what had happened, but she needed to stop letting it control her. She had taken the first step by walking away, and now she had to take the next step, rebuilding her life. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced the worst, and she had survived. She spent time with her friends and family, trying to reconnect with the people who had always been there for her. It felt strange at first, like she was starting from scratch. But it was also liberating. She didn't have to hide anymore. She didn't have to worry about the man who had betrayed her and the lies he had built around her. She had her own life now, and she was going to make the most of it. For the first time in a long time, Marianne began to feel hope again. As the weeks passed, Marianne found herself growing stronger. She took up new hobbies, rejoined old community groups, and spent time doing things that made her happy. She found peace in the small things, working in her garden, taking long walks in the park, reading books that she had put aside for years. She didn't need John. She didn't need his lies, his betrayal, or his violence. She was enough on her own. But as she rebuilt her life, the shadow of her past still lingered. She couldn't erase the pain of what had happened, nor could she forget the murder John had been involved in. No matter how hard she tried, those thoughts still crept into her mind. Sometimes, when she was alone, she wondered how things would have turned out if she had never uncovered the truth. Would she still be married to him, living a lie? Would she have been able to forgive him? The answers didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was the future. One afternoon, as she sat in her quiet apartment sipping tea, Marianne received a letter. It was from John. She hadn't heard from him since she left. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the first few lines. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an attempt to make amends. It was a final letter. A letter where John admitted everything. The money, the murder, the lies, everything. And in the final line, he begged her for forgiveness. But Marianne didn't need his forgiveness. She had already forgiven herself. She had made the hardest decision of her life, and she had survived. She didn't need John or his guilt to find peace. She had found it on her own, in the quiet moments, in the strength that had always been there but had been buried beneath the weight of betrayal. She tore up the letter and let the pieces fall to the floor. That chapter of her life was over. It was time for a new beginning, and this time it was her own. Marianne's journey didn't end the day she left John. In many ways, it had just begun. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt in control of her own fate. The scars from her marriage would never fully fade, but they no longer defined her. She had learned, in the most painful way, that she was capable of surviving anything, and that no matter how much life threw at her, she would always find a way to rebuild. With time, Marianne found herself looking forward to new opportunities. She began to trust again, not easily, but steadily. She learned that true strength comes not from holding on to the past, but from letting go of it. She focused on her own happiness, her own well-being, and slowly, the weight that had once crushed her began to lift. She reconnected with parts of herself she had forgotten in the years spent in her marriage. She traveled, met new people, and found new passions. And though she knew that some scars would never heal completely, she embraced the lessons they had taught her. Every step forward was a step towards the woman she had always been, beneath the pain, beneath the fear. In the end, Marianne realized that she had not just survived the storm. She had learned to dance in the rain, and as she looked out over the horizon, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever life had in store.